So it's awesome to be here today with the fabulous Melanie Colling, who is co-founder of Experts on Air. Melanie is going to share with us what it's like to be a podcast guest and what you should and shouldn't be doing, and maybe even what you could be doing as a podcast host with your very own podcast. So regardless of whether you've done podcasts before or whether you actually are already a podcast host, Melanie has been in this business for a long time and is going to be able to share some absolute gold and some insights to help you do it better. Because I see, Melanie, a lot of podcasts popping up all over the place, and then they die a death almost as fast because there's no sustainability, there's no system in there. And I think it's really important that when we do get the opportunity to be on air, that we're presenting in the best way possible. So Melanie, tell us a little bit more about yourself to start off with. How did you get started? What is Experts on Air and why should we care?
Thank you, Lauren, for having me. So a bit about me. My background is in project management in corporate. So for 20 plus years I did that, but I always knew that I wanted to do something else. And I was always looking. So I always had a side hustle, as they call it, and always looking to do something else. So I finally was able to make the transition about 4 years ago. And at that stage, the transition, I was doing my own business with project management with entrepreneurs. So I kind of transitioned to that, but I was doing full-time and that. So it's kind of something's got to give here. And I was able to transition out into my business full-time by going and working and facilitating some business accelerator programs in Bali with an entrepreneur group there. So I didn't jump out, straight into my own, but I was able to do that, which gave me then the flexibility. So I moved my family out to Bali and we were there for about 7 months living. Then my family wanted to come home, so I got voted off the island and had to come back to cold Melbourne. And that's when I was really able to focus on my business 100%. And so I was helping entrepreneurs build and grow their business through projects. And then I was part of a mentoring group, and my business partner that I have in Experts on Air, Brett Jarman, we were on the same mentoring group, and we were listening to each other give updates, and we're like, oh, that's kind of cool that what he's doing, and vice versa. And then he would start giving people to me because he didn't want a project management people. He was doing sales and marketing and funnels, and so I would send people to him because I wasn't doing marketing. And we're kind of going like this, and in the end we're like, you know what, we should just work together. This is crazy. So we did some stuff together, then we kind of went off and did our own thing, and then we came back when Brett rang me about 3 years ago and he said, hey, we should do a podcast together. And I was like, what's a podcast? And it sounds so crazy now. And he's like, all you got to do is talk. I'm like, yep, I can do that. So we started a podcast and interviewing people, and it was really cool. And he had the understanding of the sales and marketing background and the platform of podcasting. And so together, he then started Experts on Air and the podcast production side. And then together we came to do the podcast booking agency, which is the bit that I focus on. So it's been a bit of a journey, and I'm really, really enjoying podcasting. It's such an exciting platform. It's really growing. And, I just love seeing when people can, take the opportunity to get into podcasting and see, all the opportunities that come from it.
Brilliant. I love it. It's such a similar story to myself and Annette. I'm giggling away in the background where you just you orbit each other and eventually you go, yes. You know what, let's just work together. This is ridiculous. So awesome story. Love it. So tell us more about Experts on Air and the podcast booking. How does it work and what do you do?
Sure. So what we do is we match guests to hosts. So we work with the guest. They're our client basically. And we create what we call in podcasting world as a one sheet. So, it's got the guest's bio and image, audience that they want to talk to, or that which is really their target market, and then talking points. So they're things like questions that people always ask you, or keynote speeches that you give, or topics that you can talk on till the cows come home. And they're kind of things that will pique the interest of a host. So we put that together with them, and it's kind of a brainstorming session that we do that. And then if we don't have hosts on our books that meet their criteria and that have their audience, we go out and find them. So we're a little bit different in some agencies, and there's agencies in the US because obviously they're a bit more advanced with podcasting than we are. Some in the UK, but none that really focused on Australia, New Zealand, or Australasia. So that's really where we fit in. But in saying that, we don't just service that area. Like, we've got podcast guests all over the place and also hosts from around the globe. So what the difference with us is that we go out and find the right hosts for our guests to be on. And that's all about knowing the audience that the guest wants to get in front of, and then going and find the host that has that audience. So that's the kind of strategic part that we do.
Brilliant. Love it. So as a person who really understands how podcasting works and what hosts are doing and what they're looking for, what's one of your biggest tips for somebody who wants to be a guest to choose the right podcast to be on? I mean, you gave a bit of a hint there that it's all about making sure, obviously, you're speaking to the right audience. But what are some of the things you should be looking for if you're putting yourself out there and looking for a podcast to be a guest on? How can you choose the best one for you?
Awesome. So great question. And there's a couple of things that we look for. And a lot of people ask us, well, they come to us and say, oh, I want to be on the Oprah podcast or something massive like that. Like, don't we all, come on. And we say to them, look, you probably need to engage a PR agency if you want to go down that path. And a lot of people are obsessed with podcasts with huge listeners and numbers. And we always say to people, it's not about the numbers, it's about how many of those people are engaged listeners, because Oprah might have millions of listeners, but they have different things that they listen to Oprah for. Whereas if someone's doing a podcast on a particular topic, then they'll have the listeners that want to know about that niche, that industry, that field, or that topic. So it's really about knowing your audience, what they're listening to. So put yourself in the shoes of the audience, and what would they want to know and what would they want to listen to. And then it's about having a look at all the podcasts that kind of cover that topic or field or industry or niche, and then how often are they posting. So yourself, when you're listening to a podcast, if you're really engaged in it, you want to hear from, like, you'll listen to past episodes, but then once you've caught up, you're like, okay, I want to hear again, and you don't want to wait a month. So, if they're posting a month, it's like, how engaged are they with their podcast and their audience? Fortnightly is okay. Weekly would be ideal, because you know that they've got engaged listeners and that they're also doing something offline with them, as in not just a podcast, but they've got a social media network that they're engaging their audience with as well, so that they're active. And then that if you go and do an interview with them, that they're going to be sharing it with their network. And that's really what you want to take advantage of as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tapping into the host's database, really, isn't it? So
yes.
It's so vital, guys, to remember it's all about the audience. I mean, yes, you could talk standing on your head about just about anything, but what do you really want to engage with people about? I love the fact we talked about quality over quantity. You're better off to have an engaged audience of 100 people who are absolutely keen on hearing about what you're talking about, rather than going to a podcast that's got thousands of people, but none of them are listening. And I like that tip around look for podcasts that are active. As you say, if it was a podcast and the last time they did an interview was 2014, chances are the podcast doesn't exist anymore. And as you say, pointing out, look, if someone's regularly on there, they've got someone on there every month or every fortnight or every week. But more importantly, if they've stacked up, like, here's all the, go on. It's a really great tip, Melanie. Go and listen to the podcast. I mean,
yes, that's the number one.
Number one. I mean, why would you want to be on a podcast if you hadn't actually already thought to yourself, well, I'd love to be on this guy's show? So yeah, go and have a listen to who the guests have been on there, listen to the style of the interviewer, and go, is this somewhere I'd like to position my brand? It just makes sense, doesn't it? Absolutely.
Exactly. And is it someone that you want to be connected with, because you will be connected with them forever because you've done an interview? Does the style match yours? Would you feel comfortable joining your brand with the brand of the host? Would you be comfortable that they're going to promote you and you're going to promote them, and vice versa? And that you would be comfortable, talking to them, that their style matches yours, because there's nothing worse getting on an interview where you're not in sync with the host and it's really awkward. And different hosts have different styles. So some will have rapid fire questions that they ask everybody at the end of an interview. Some will have pre-formatted questions that they ask every guest. Some will just be, we'll just have a conversation and see where it goes, and it's really casual. So again, what suits your personality. Like, don't go and do something where you're going to feel really uncomfortable, because it won't be a great interview.
Yeah, absolutely. That alignment is so important. And that's worth doing, isn't it? Just have a think about the alignment of your brand. If your brand was a product and you put it on a shelf somewhere, what other brands would sit around it and support it? So yeah, thinking about that's absolutely vital. So when it comes to, and I mean, you've hosted podcasts as well, haven't you, Melanie? So from that point of view, what in your experience makes a really good podcast guest? The people you just sort of go, yes, that was so good. What are the aspects of a great podcast guest?
I suppose as a host, it's making that person feel comfortable. And setting the expectations. So giving them as much information as they need to come in prepared. And again, what's the format of and style of your podcast, and let them know. So it's doing the preparation up front. I always have a chat to my hosts beforehand, or, I've either been speaking to them for some other reason. And I'll say, hey, I'd really love to, have a conversation on my podcast, like interview about this, because I think that would really be valuable to my audience. And so I'll already have pre-prepared them. So that's really important, is to do the preparation and then make them feel, comfortable when they come in. But then it's just going with the conversation. So, my podcast is very conversational. I don't have any pre-formatted questions. I mean, it's called the Business Connections Podcast, and we just talk. My only question that I ask every guest is around how did connections, help or impact you in your personal business life, and I get them to share a story around that. So that's the only one thing that I really focus on, but I kind of go with the guest and, see where that takes you. And I think if you allow them to lead the conversation, that's when you get the real gems and the real magic that comes out of it. Because you're just letting them share. And that's really what you invited them on for, is to share their expertise and give value. So
brilliant. I think one of my favourite podcasts that I always flick on if I'm driving anywhere of a distance is Conversations, ABC Conversations with Richard Feidler. Either he's an extraordinarily good interviewer, or the editing is fantastic, or a bit of both probably, but it sucks you in. You can be driving along and you're so sucked into the story. He's so good at interviewing. He doesn't interrupt the person. He leads them off on these little tangents, but he keeps them on the same track of their story and seems to ask these really relevant questions at the right time. So a little bit, I know there's an interviewer that I love from years and years, Michael Parkinson. Everyone of our age will remember good old Parky. But he had that way of sitting and letting the guests speak and giving them time and giving them space, and then just putting in the right question at the right time. So those sorts of hosts are, and I'm just guessing that's practice, Melanie. That's practice and timing and being prepared to listen in order to draw a story out of somebody, rather than just, I'm your host and you will listen to me and answer my questions.
Absolutely. And I love that fact that you said, just sit back and let them, talk and kind of lead it, because that's what Parky does, doesn't it? Like you said, and those good interviewers, they let the guest shine. And look, when you start, like if I listen to my first podcast interview, it's probably horrendous, but it's like everything. Like when we start, we think, oh my God, is anyone going to listen to this? But you get better, and, it becomes more natural, and you find your flow, and, you always have those, interesting conversations. And I think Parky had one, didn't he say his worst interview guest was Meg Ryan, or someone like that, because it was just so awkward and prickly. And he couldn't get around her, like she just had her wall up, and he wasn't getting anywhere with her. So you're always going to come across that, but in the powers of podcasts, you can edit everything. It's awesome.
Cut that bit out where I sounded like a complete goose. Exactly.
Yes. Exactly.
I had the wrong name for the guest's children or something else that happened. It was really embarrassing. The other interviewer that we all love, of course, is Graham Norton, and he's well known for the fact that he has this amazing research team. So I'm also assuming that if you're a good podcast host, you've gone and done your research on your guest. Is it the same, the flip side round? If you're a good so let's talk now about being a podcast guest and what makes a good guest. Is it worth, yes, listening to the podcast and actually getting to know your host is a blimmin' good idea. But what other research and how prepared could a guest be before they get onto a podcast?
So again, it's a bit like, stalking and researching your host. So, go and listen to a podcast, go and see what they're doing on social media. What are they talking about? What programs have they got on offer? Just so them and what's going on. But also on the flip side, is being a good guest is providing your host with all the information up front. So, some podcast hosts don't have a research team, or, it's just one person. And so I remember doing an interview with Ali Ady from She Mentors. And we knew each other and we'd been chatting, and she said, I'd love to interview in the podcast. I said, that'd be great. So I sent her all this information, and one of it was my guest profile. And I think I sent it to you too, Lauren, was a presentation I'd done recently on the subject that we were going to talk about. And Ali actually said to me afterwards, she said, you made it so easy for me to formulate my questions. Like, I just had all my questions done in like 5-10 minutes. If all my guests were like that, you'd make my job so much easier. And I was like, I didn't think about it like that, because again, I know the people that I'm going to interview on my podcast. So, I kind of know a bit about them. But when you give all this information, you're going to make it so much easier for the host. How cool is that? The host is going to remember you. If they want to talk about the particular topic that you're an expert on, of course they're going to ask you back or ask you to do something else with them because you've made their life easier. And that's, if we can make anybody's lives easier, that's great.
And I'm assuming that podcast guests talk amongst each other and go, I had this most awful guest on the other day, avoid them like the plague. But then this person's, do you refer guests to other podcasts as well and say, I know you do that for your own business, but as podcast hosts, do you tend to go, I had this really awesome person on the other day, they've got a great story, and you refer them to other people?
Yeah, I do that naturally anyway, but yes, you do. It's like anything, you get a reputation for, doing a good job or a bad job. And definitely podcast hosts talk. It's kind of, even though there's lots of podcasts, it's kind of a small community and it's really connected. So yeah, if you do a good job, the word will go out. Yeah. And I know another thing that someone recently, because we used to be Melbourne Podcasters Meetup group, but now we're global because, we're all in isolation.
Done all sorts of things.
I know. So now we're global podcasters. And one of the speakers that we had early on in our Meetup group said about, he always asks the next guest for a referral for the next guest. Like, who would you say that someone else that would be of value to me and to my audience, which is so cool. And so, podcast hosts will ask like, oh, I'm looking, and there's lots of groups that I'm part of, and that they'll say, oh, anyone knows someone that's an expert in A, B, C, D. So, if you do the right thing, you're out there and being connected. Podcast guests do, or hosts do, share information. So
nice. I love it. So that's a great tip. I love that idea of utilizing your own guests to line up your next speakers. That's such a good idea.
So clever.
Very, very clever. What a great tip. If you've got a podcast that you host, there's a great tip. Just one out of this awesome interview. Take that one. Okay, right. Now I've got myself a booking on a podcast. It's all very exciting. I've given the host my one sheet and my bio and my headshot, and they've got everything they need to know about me. What am I going to say? A lot of people are going, oh my God, I've got this interview. What do I say in a podcast? Any ideas and tips for people, Melanie, who are getting these gigs or want to be on podcasts as to what they should and shouldn't say in an interview?
Yeah, so it's really a conversation between two people. That's what I love about podcasting. It's not a sales pitch. So you don't have to go on there and think, oh, I've got to sell something, and because that's really not what podcasting is about. And I think we're all over being sold to, which is why podcasting is such a cool medium, because it's a conversation with two people. Other people might want to listen and learn from that. And so I would just say, relax. Share your story, let people get to know you. That's what you're there on the podcast to do, is to get people to know you. And then, just answer the questions, go with the flow, give some advice, give value. And the number one thing is that you are there for the audience and you're there to give value. And if you just keep that front of mind, then, answer the questions with the audience in mind, that you want to give as much value as you can, and it'll be an awesome interview.
Yeah, I love it. I think the nicest thing that I like about podcasting is what you said as well. It's like they're getting a taster of you, aren't they? The listeners are getting to feel a little bit about your personality. They learn about your mission and your passion and your story and your challenges and all those sorts of things. And I guess as well, I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Tracy Sheen who said to me once, I think it was a term she used, that podcasting is a little bit like communication, she calls it. So it's the sort of thing that you stick in your ears and you listen to on the bus to work, or when you're going for a jog, or you're walking the kids back from school, or whatever it is. So people tend to be doing things, don't they, while they're listening to a podcast. They're doing the housework or whatever. So if it's not a conversation, if it's not interesting and intriguing, people will just zone out, won't they? Oh, a squirrel, and they'll all of a sudden they're not listening to what you're saying anymore. So I think you're right, Melanie. Do you even suggest when you're on a podcast, like having a couple of dot points written down to say, look, I've got to make sure I cover this in my story? Because you can, especially if it's a conversational style podcast, you can end up going down a rabbit hole and then you forget, hey, there was all this other cool stuff I meant to mention.
Yep.
So,
yeah.
And unless you've been interviewed on a regular basis and you know how to steer the conversation back to those points, they'll be lost. So having a few dot points, maybe. Anything else that podcast guests can be planning or getting ready for before they're interviewed?
I think you just got to know your strategy. So that's the biggest thing is, why are you doing podcast interviews? So you've got to have your strategy and then know what that is, and then you go into that conversation with the right mindset. So you know what you want to get out of it, and you know what you want to give back to that host and that audience. So that's a lot of the work that we do up front with guests. And the stuff that I'm kind of doing on the side now is around mentoring people around, connecting and collaborating and being good guests, is around just, knowing what you want to talk about and the outcome that you want to get from the conversation, and having that top of mind. So dot points are great. Maybe remind yourself of your offer, or what do you want that person to do with you afterwards? Because that's the whole point of it, is that they get to know you, like you said, and people connect differently with a story. So if you tell your story, then they get to know you, and that's really hard to do via text when you're blogging or via social media. And ultimately, when they get to hear you, then they get to hear your personality, and that kind of comes through. So again, they're hearing you, so they're getting your voice connection. They're hearing your story, so they're getting connection through your story, and then they're hearing your expertise and the value that you can add, and then you'll have all your links and stuff on the show notes. But what's the outcome that you want for that? So you might be launching an online program, for example, so you want to make sure that you mention that in there, and that your link at the end of the show notes is about that one thing. And I think, rather than having a million links, like, have one, so that they just go to one thing, rather than, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram and all these kind of things. It's like, once they link to one thing of you, then they can go and find you after that.
Yeah, great tip. I love it. Keep it simple, eh? And that whole idea of starting with the end in mind. So you're quite right. Choosing a type, if you're launching a book or a program, or you've just won an award, or there's something new that you're doing, or you've got a new event that's happening or something, choose your timing, I guess, as well, Melanie, on when to go on. So also, I know we talked as well before we started recording the interview around the value of podcasts for the sheer fact that they hang around. They're a little bit like the magazine, that you read at the doctor's surgery that's from 2014. We can keep our podcast interviews. And I think that's the nicest thing that I've discovered about Experts on Air, is that there's this extra bit that you guys do that enables people not just to be booked and be on a podcast, but to actually leverage the fact that they've now got a podcast interview. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, awesome. So the most important thing and the best support you can give your host is to make sure that you post your interview. And that's one of the, I suppose, the main bugbears of a host, is that they have a guest on and that guest never shares their episode. And,
Crickets.
And they're like, what? And they kind of think to themselves, why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't you take full advantage of being, on a podcast? So that's the bit that we help support our guests with. And we make sure that for our hosts, we make sure our guests are posting their episode, that they've appeared in it. And so what we do is we take the link from the host. Sometimes hosts will create social media collateral and things for you, and links, and ask you to post. Other hosts will just give you the link and leave it to you to post. So we make sure that we give the link, and then we make some other social media collateral for our guests as well. And then we do all the text and things, so they can just cut and paste and post it on Facebook and Instagram and wherever they are, or wherever their audience is, to make it easy for them, but also to see that they're supporting the host. And then we also share it on our network as Experts on Air. So if you're a guest through us, you get leverage the host's audience, you post it with your network, and then we post it with Experts on Air network. So you're kind of getting 3 ways of leveraging, and then your episode is out there forever. Like, podcasts never go away, they're evergreen. So you can repurpose your podcast. It's transcribed, the host has done all the work for you. Take that, create a blog post, create social media. Something might happen and you've talked about it in this particular interview, go back and find it and then repost and say, hey, I spoke about this in this episode. and repost it. So it's always there. You don't have to always create new content. Like, this is content that you've created, you've spoken it, just go and use it to your advantage.
Yeah, it's a great tip, because I think people do fall into that trap, don't they, of constantly thinking they've got to do new stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got to do a Facebook Live, or I've got to do another blog or whatever, and you've already got the content there. So great tip. So tell us a little bit more, Melanie, about how people can interact with Experts on Air. And I know you've got a very special offer for our group as well.
Yeah, so you can go and find us at www.expertsonair.fm. And you can find out about creating your own podcast or being a guest on other people's podcasts. And we've got some training about how to create your own podcast if you want to know how to do it yourself, because a lot of people want to know the mechanics behind it. So there's a couple of different options. And then the other thing that I'm going to offer your listeners, Lauren, is a 20-minute free strategy session. So that's usually $200 US, but that's really a discussion about, is podcasting right for me, and which option is right for me, and how do I go about doing it? So, hopefully you come away after that session with a couple of ideas and action steps that you can go and put in place, or the start of a strategy that you can go, okay, this can, replace something I'm already doing, or complement something that I'm already doing, or it might be something I do later, but at least you know what the options are for you and how it would work in your business and how it makes sense.
Brilliant. So that's if you want to be a podcast guest, or if you even want to be a podcast host. It's the same
Either. Yep.
Fabulous. Love it.
Yep.
So that's a free session with Melanie. It's the first 10 people that do that. So guys, click on that link and make sure you book your strategy session with Melanie. An awesome opportunity for you. Just check out how you can be really leveraging podcasts to get your brand out there. Now, Melanie, what I want to talk about at the end of this is, what if I go, okay, this is awesome. Maybe I should start a podcast. Everyone said to me, why haven't you got a podcast, Lauren? If I've got the time. I've had a brainwave that maybe I read each chapter of my book and turn that into a podcast, given that I've got to record an audio book at some stage. So why don't I kill two birds with one stone? See, thinking. But yeah, what are the tips, and why should you, or even maybe why shouldn't you start a podcast? Who's it for? Why should you or shouldn't you do it? And if I am thinking of starting my own podcast, where do I start? What's the first thing I need to think about?
Awesome. So the first thing you need to think about is strategy. So how does it fit in with what I'm currently doing? How does it make sense for my business? Does it make sense for my business? Is my audience listening to podcasts? What else are they listening to? Can I slot that in? And part of the strategy and the stuff that we work, because we work with experts, so they're experts in the industry field niche. And it's about giving them a platform to become an authority in their field. So that's what we use podcasting for. And it's about taking what they know and getting it out there in podcast, like audio form, and then repurposing that to become a newsletter, a blog, social media collateral. So, experts are good at what they do, and that's what they get paid for. They don't get paid for doing all this marketing stuff, which we kind of all get sucked into as business owners, doing all this extra stuff. So what we want to do is keep them in their zone of genius and keep doing that, and then take away all that other stuff that they think they have to do. So we use podcasting as the top of that funnel. They record their voice, interview, whatever they're doing, and then we repurpose the back end of that for all the other marketing collateral. So again, it's like, is it the right medium for you? Are your audience there going to listen? We use it as a top of a funnel, so people get to know you, and then you can direct them into other things that you're doing. So ultimately you want to get them onto a mailing list, or a newsletter, or something else that you want to do with them. But it's a good way for you to be seen and be heard, and to have consistent content that you're giving in an easy way to do that. So, if you think that's something that you want to do, and you're doing all this stuff and you're writing blogs, then you might actually be able to start with a podcast and repurpose all that, and then you don't have to write blogs. So that might save you time. So, it's again, what have you currently got going? Does it make sense to add podcasting, or can it replace something? How can I use it and grow my authority?
Yeah, brilliant. I love it. I love that repurposing, because we just only have 24 hours in a day. Everybody has that. So, why, thrash yourself trying to get this new stuff out there where you can actually repurpose? It's brilliant.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people, when they think about podcasting, as you've said, the first thing they think is, it's the technology and the editing and all the stuff I have to think about. you take that whole hassle away, don't you, from them? That they can just get on and be the expert, create that great content from what they've got, and then repurpose it and get on with doing what you're doing, which is so good.
Absolutely.
So any real top tips for podcasters that you'd like to leave us with today, Melanie, that people might go, oh, I'm going to try that? Is there a channel or a network or something that you're seeing, a trend in podcasting that people are starting to pick up on, something that you've seen or noticed that you'd like to share today with people to go, hey, you might want to check that out?
Well, I think just touching on the point that you made about, do I create a podcast and read my book chapters? I think that's an awesome idea, because then every chapter you can then expand on those. You could have every chapter as a series of podcasts. So some people think I've got to do a podcast and go forever. You can actually just do it as a series. Like, think of it as a Netflix series and go, I'm going to do 12 episodes on this subject.
Yeah.
Right. And then the next 12 episodes, you might go, season 2 is going to be on this topic, right? So you don't have to think, oh my God, I'm going to talk about this to the cows come home and drive everybody crazy or drive myself insane. So think about, series of podcasts, or what topics you would talk about, what makes sense. That might change as you get to engage your audience. But also the other way around for you is you've already written your book, but other people want to write a book. So imagine like doing a podcast and that becomes your book.
Yeah, brilliant.
Like, how cool is that? That's the best way to write a book, isn't it? Like, that
you've got a dislike for writing things, Melanie. I'm picking up on this. I'd rather talk than write. So yeah,
you've got me. Yeah, I can talk for ages, but sitting there and writing, it's like, oh, you don't know where to start.
Yeah.
But when you talk, it just comes out, and you're actually using your natural words too. I think when we write things, we think that we have to sound, more professional than we are, or use these different words. But actually, when we speak it, we're using our own words, which is then, we're going to attract the people that connect with us because we're being more genuine.
Yeah, more authentic, absolutely. Melanie, it's been a great pleasure to chat with you today. I feel that we could chat for hours, but unfortunately we will bore people. I love that tip. Quite often, I think experts fall into that trap of vomiting on people with content. Mm-hmm. And what a great tip to think, okay, if it's about this, maybe it's about wellness or whatever, could you break that down into a series of 12 episodes rather than trying to give all that information in one single podcast? So great tip to break it down and chunk it down for people to really listen. And as you say, it's probably better to have a 15 to 20 minute podcast of great value than trying to squish everything into an hour long that people by the end of it going, I can't deal with this anymore, I've just got overload. So great tip with that one. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you for all your advice. If you are looking at this and thinking maybe podcasting is for me, then please check out those links. Go and check out that awesome offer that Melanie has to do a strategy session with her to get clear on not only why you should be podcasting, but what you're going to be doing with it, how it aligns with your business, which podcasts to go for, and whether you should indeed think about being a podcast host, or if you are already hosting, how you can make your podcast even better. So get in touch with Melanie. A great offer to spend some time with her for nothing, which is awesome, giving away your fabulous expertise for those first top people who go and do that. And yeah, guys, just get into it. Find out more about the experts on air. The link is there. Go and check it out and get yourself heard and noticed, guys, because you do have amazing expertise that needs to be out there in the world, and podcasting is an awesome way to do it. So thank you so much, Melanie, for being here and for sharing with us your knowledge. It's just been fantastic. And we look forward to lots of people coming and talking to you more about podcasting.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It's been awesome. Thanks for having me.